He walked into Buckingham Palace like it was just another tea party, but this was no ordinary royal outing. Prince George, just 11 years old, was about to step into the biggest moment of his life. While war veterans shared memories that shaped the free world, George didn't just listen, he connected. Side by side with William and Catherine, his every move was watched by millions. The weight of the monarchy? Quietly resting on his small shoulders. And as one 101-year-old veteran looked him in the eye and said, "It's important you're here," the nation realized something historic was unfolding. As the echoes of history reverberated through the palace, the young prince's journey into royal responsibilities had just begun. 80 years ago, as sirens fell silent and crowds danced in the streets, the world tasted peace after years of unspeakable horror. It was May 8th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The end of the Second World War in Europe wasn't just a historical event. It was a moment that stitched itself into the soul of nations. For Britain, it marked the survival of a country bombed, battered, and nearly broken. Families who had waited years to embrace their sons, daughters, and lovers finally exhaled. Churchill's voice echoed through radios and bomb shelters, calling it the beginning of a new dawn. But beneath the cheers and bunting, there was pain millions lost. Cities turned to ash. Futures altered forever. VE Day wasn't just about triumph, it was about remembrance, about honoring those who had endured the unthinkable so others could live free. And the British royal family, then and now, has always stood at the heart of that remembrance. King George VI addressed the nation with trembling conviction as London smoldered around him. Queen Elizabeth, later the Queen Mother, walked rubble-strewn streets, comforting survivors, not as royalty, but as fellow citizens of a shaken empire. In the decades that followed, their legacy of quiet strength and national unity was passed down, and with it, their duty to remember. Queen Elizabeth II upheld it with relentless devotion, her presence at VE Day services, her speeches filled with solemn gratitude. Her voice reminded the world that peace, once won, should never be taken for granted. Even as the years rolled on and the veterans grew fewer, the crown never let the silence swallow their sacrifice. In 2025, the 80th anniversary of VE Day arrived not as a distant memory, but as a haunting mirror to our present. The number of surviving veterans had dwindled to a mere handful each one, a living relic of an era that shaped everything. Their stories, once abundant, now rare, carry an urgency that can't be ignored. These men and women didn't just witness history. They are history. And as they stood in the shadow of Buckingham Palace once more, medals glinting on fragile chests, the world quietly realized this may be the last time we hear them speak. The last time their eyes meet the eyes of those born into the peace they paid for. Across the UK and beyond, commemorations took shape. From Westminster to Normandy, military flypasts roared overhead, while silent tributes rippled through towns and villages. The Royal British Legion, ever faithful, orchestrated one of the largest national remembrance campaigns since the end of the war. In cathedrals, schools, and living rooms, stories were told. Stories of sacrifice, fear, hope. Stories that demanded not sympathy, but understanding. And it wasn't about war, it was about legacy. A legacy now more fragile than ever. But even amidst this tide of memory, a shift was quietly unfolding. The monarchy, once defined by those who led during war, now finds itself led by those born of peace. And as the world paused to remember, a new generation, one not marked by gunfire or ration books, stepped forward to carry the torch. Amidst these commemorations, a new generation steps forward to honor the past. Dressed in a crisp navy suit and a blue tie that matched the calm focus in his eyes, Prince George didn't just arrive, he entered. The grand marble hall of Buckingham Palace has seen kings crowned, treaties signed, and battles mourned. But this was something new. This was a quiet beginning, a symbolic handover. And as George walked in beside William and Catherine, it wasn't ceremony that drew the eyes of the crowd. It was presence. At just 11 years old, he moved with a composure far beyond his years, not rehearsed or robotic, but attentive, genuine. He wasn't performing royalty. He was embodying it. With every handshake and nod, he was writing a page that future generations might one day reference, the day the boy prince began to walk in the footsteps of kings. His first conversation set the tone. Alfred Littlefield, 101 years old, and one of the last surviving D-Day veterans, sat quietly until George leaned in, eyes wide and voice calm. "What was it like when you were coming in?" he asked. It wasn't scripted. It was curiosity. The pie kind that can't be faked. Alfred didn't sugarcoat it. "Pretty awful," he replied. But then, the old man paused, looked into the face of the young heir, and said something that hung in the air like prophecy. "It's very important you are here today." That wasn't a compliment. It was a burden. A baton passed, and it landed. Throughout the hall, the atmosphere changed. Veterans who had survived the unimaginable weren't meeting a child. They were speaking to history's next witness. At one point, George stood before a table of black and white photographs and artifacts, remnants of lives shaped in fire and fear. As he examined a picture of a Sherman tank, he turned to 99-year-old Charles O'Born and asked, "Were they hard to operate? It must have been very tough with the weather." Again, no theatrics, no fluff, just instinctive recognition that these were more than machines, they were survival. Behind the young prince, Catherine moved quietly, guiding without controlling. Her hand gently touched his shoulder, her smile never leaving her face. It was pride, but it was also strategy. The world was watching, and George was showing exactly what the monarchy needed: dignity without stiffness, connection without ego. William kept a close eye, exchanging subtle glances with his son, allowing him space but never letting him stray too far. In that shared glance between father and son was a history understood, not spoken. The press, naturally, captured it all. But for once, headlines weren't hunting scandal. They were filled with admiration. A future king in the making? George captures the spirit of VE Day. The images of George bowing slightly to a 98-year-old codebreaker, or shaking hands with a naval veteran whose hands trembled from age, weren't just moments, they were statements. The future of the monarchy wasn't being discussed in parliamentary halls or whispered behind palace doors. It was being felt in that room. Beyond the formalities, it was the heartfelt exchanges that truly marked the day. When a young prince listens intently to tales of valor, history finds a new voice. And that voice echoed louder than ever in the halls of Buckingham Palace, not through speeches or headlines, but in the quiet, personal exchanges between Prince George and those who had once stood face to face with death. These weren't rehearsed photo ops or ceremonial gestures. They were raw, unscripted conversations, one generation bearing witness to another. George, standing before men and women whose hands had once held rifles, coded enemy messages and pulled wounded comrades to safety, listened not as royalty, but as a student of legacy. He wasn't just learning about the past, he was inheriting it. As the veterans spoke, something extraordinary unfolded. Their stories weren't filled with boastful declarations or romanticized glory. They were real, honest. Alfred Littlefield spoke of Normandy not with pride, but with quiet pain. "It was awful," he told George, "but it had to be done." That kind of truth, that naked recounting of terror and duty, left a mark deeper than any textbook ever could. George didn't flinch. He didn't look away, and the veterans noticed. One turned to William and said, "He's got it in him. You should be proud." These were warriors, and in their eyes, George passed a test that couldn't be taught or forced. He listened with respect. What struck many was how these stories, once considered old memories, suddenly felt vital. In George's presence, they gained urgency. Because soon, these voices will fall silent. And what happens then? That's the burden quietly shifting to his young shoulders. The role of oral history of lived experience passed hand to hand, like a flame is not ceremonial. It's survival. Survival of memory, of identity. And in that room, surrounded by the last living witnesses to one of humanity's darkest hours, George became more than a royal figurehead. He became a bridge. Veterans spoke openly about why they came to be seen, yes, but more importantly, to be understood. They weren't chasing medals or applause. They wanted to know someone would carry their truth forward. And when they saw George, leaning forward, asking questions about frost-bitten nights in Belgian forests, or the hum of engines during air raids, they saw hope, not just in his title, but in his attention. Because when a child of peace takes in the burden of war, the cycle of remembrance stays unbroken. It wasn't lost on the crowd that these interactions were shaping more than just an event. They were shaping George. These were the moments that plant seeds of leadership, of empathy, of responsibility. He didn't leave the palace that day as a different boy, but he left with something lodged deep inside, the echo of sacrifice. And in that echo is duty. As stories were shared and memories honored, the royal family's commitment to service was reaffirmed. In unity, the royal family stood, bridging past sacrifices with future promises. On that day, every step they took into Buckingham Palace carried centuries of legacy and the weight of recent wounds. Side by side, they didn't just appear as individuals, they moved as a singular force. King Charles, still recovering from health concerns that shook the Commonwealth, stood tall in his grandfather's naval uniform, a silent but pointed tribute to King George VI, who led Britain through the darkest hours of war. It wasn't nostalgia, it was declaration that despite internal fractures, scandal, and speculation, the institution would endure. And as the world watched, it became clear. This was no ordinary royal appearance. It was a strategic reminder that monarchy, at its core, is not about personalities. It's about permanence. Prince William and Princess Catherine, poised and composed, flanked their son as if shielding him from the spotlight while subtly preparing him for it. Their chemistry, once questioned in media cycles hungry for cracks, was now a fortress of quiet strength. And then came the softer symbols, Charlotte, with her gentle smile. Louis absorbing every moment with curiosity. Though young, their presence wasn't accidental. It was calculated, because the monarchy knows what it means to play the long game. And on VE Day, it wasn't just the war veterans who were honored, it was the family itself, staging an image of intergenerational resilience. But beneath that polished exterior was a deeper narrative: redemption. The royal family, fractured in recent years by Meghan and Harry's bombshell interviews, public controversies, and a wave of anti-monarchist sentiment, had been teetering on the edge. Headlines screamed division, polls dipped, trust eroded. Yet here they were together, projecting strength not with words, but with presence. It was no coincidence that Charles wore his grandfather's uniform. It was no accident that Catherine stood hand in hand with George in the same marble hall where Queen Elizabeth once stood during wartime receptions. Every detail was a signal. Every interaction, a message. The crowd noticed. So did the media. For a moment, the noise of politics, personal scandals, and shifting public opinion faded. What remained was an unmistakable image of continuity. One generation honoring another. One family refusing to falter under pressure. And while not everyone watching believed in the crown, many still believed in what it represents: duty, tradition, and the unbroken thread of history. It wasn't about blind loyalty. It was about shared memory. The royal family didn't have to say a word. Their togetherness said everything. But even in this display of solidarity, subtle tensions lingered beneath the surface. Because, while the family presented a united front, individual journeys within the monarchy were unfolding. With grace and poise, the Princess of Wales nurtures the next generation of royal duty. She didn't need a grand speech or sweeping gestures to command attention. Catherine's power was quieter and perhaps more enduring. While the spotlight lingered on Prince George during the VE Day commemorations, it was Catherine who ensured he knew exactly how to stand in it. Every nod she gave him, every gentle touch on his arm, wasn't choreography, it was mentorship. Not just of a prince, but of a future king. Behind every moment of George's engagement with the veterans stood his mother, guiding him with silent strength and unmistakable clarity. She wasn't stealing the moment, she was shaping it. Her role at the event was deliberate, yet natural. Catherine moved through the marble hall not like royalty above the crowd, but as a bridge between history and modernity. She listened intently to stories from veterans, asked questions with compassion, and shared quiet glances of understanding with those who had seen more than most could imagine. There was nothing performative about it. This wasn't about optics, it was about connection. Her ability to engage without pretension reminded many of the late Queen Elizabeth, whose strength came from listening more than speaking. And as Catherine leaned in to explain wartime photographs to George, or gently steered him toward a waiting veteran, it became clear she wasn't just fulfilling a duty. She was passing one down. Balancing that with motherhood, under global scrutiny, would break most people. But Catherine wore it like armor. While she guided her son through the intricacies of royal responsibility, she never lost sight of who he was a child, absorbing the gravity of history through stories, not speeches. That balance the tightrope walk between duty and love is something only she could navigate so seamlessly. And the public noticed. Social media flooded with praise, not just for George's confidence, but for Catherine's presence. Headlines didn't call her flawless. They called her formidable. In a royal family still healing from fractures, she became the steady hand, the quiet force holding it all together. That strength wasn't accidental. It came from years of growing within an institution that can both elevate and isolate. Catherine's upbringing, grounded in humility, gave her an advantage no royal protocol could teach. She understood people, not just tradition. And more importantly, she understood the power of legacy. Her values, forged long before titles, shaped how she now carries one of the most delicate roles in the monarchy, not just as the wife of the heir, but as the woman quietly preparing the next generation to lead. She doesn't chase the spotlight, yet it always finds her, because composure like hers is rare, and in today's monarchy, essential. Catherine's presence at the VE Day celebration wasn't a side note, it was a cornerstone. A signal that while the monarchy is steeped in tradition, its evolution is already underway. Not in grand reforms or declarations, but in the gentle hand of a mother helping her son learn how to lead. As Catherine supports her son, the future of the monarchy begins to take shape. For Prince George, the path to kingship is paved with tradition, expectation, and newfound responsibilities. He may still be years away from a throne, but history has shown us that the crown doesn't wait. It molds, it watches, and when necessary, it calls early. George's public debut at the VE Day celebration wasn't just a ceremonial appearance, it was a turning point. Because for royal heirs, there is no such thing as childhood in the traditional sense. There is only preparation. And in the eyes of those veterans, in the smiles of his parents, and in the quiet approval of the monarch himself, a new chapter was already being written. One where George, still shy but focused, began stepping into the long shadow cast by centuries of sovereigns before him. The royal family has never been subtle when it comes to signaling legacy, and the signals at Buckingham Palace that day were impossible to miss. This wasn't just about remembrance, it was about succession. Just as William had once accompanied Princess Diana and King Charles to hospitals, charity events, and memorials in the 1990s, George is now being initiated into that same rhythm. But where William's training was marked by emotional turbulence, George's introduction appears far more calculated, less reactive, more strategic. It's clear that the monarchy, burned by past mistakes and propelled by modern scrutiny, is intent on shaping a future king with both heart and discipline. Every handshake George offered that day, every question he asked, wasn't just a gesture of politeness. It was part of a greater script, quietly preparing him for a crown that, while distant, grows heavier by the year. And the weight is not just symbolic, it's emotional, it's generational. The world is no longer content to see royals as distant figures dressed in tradition. They want empathy, relevance, and that demand begins with George. The public has already begun to form opinions, projecting hopes and fears onto him as they once did with William, and before that, Charles. Social media lights up after every appearance. Every tilt of the head, every word uttered, becomes part of the growing archive of a boy fated to lead. And though his role today may seem small, these early moments matter more than anyone outside the palace gates can fully grasp. Because kings aren't born in coronation halls. They're built in rooms like the Grand Marble Hall, through conversations with war heroes, gentle nudges from a guiding mother, and silent nods from a watching nation. George's presence on that day was quiet but powerful, his demeanor reserved but telling. He was watching, listening, absorbing the gravity of what this role demands. And the monarchy, well aware of shifting tides in public sentiment, is using these moments to gently reintroduce its future. There are no declarations, no dramatic unveilings, only carefully chosen events where the future king begins to show who he might become. These are the formative years, and they are not being wasted. Because behind the smiles and photo ops lies a very deliberate truth. The crown is not a gift. It's a burden passed through generations. As the young prince embraces his destiny, the monarchy looks ahead with cautious optimism. In the court of public opinion, every royal gesture is both observed and interpreted. And when it comes to a child like Prince George, the scrutiny becomes even more complicated, layered with admiration, cynicism, and expectation. The moment he entered Buckingham Palace for the VE Day celebration, headlines were already being drafted. Photos of him speaking with veterans flooded news outlets within hours. "The future king meets history," one headline declared, but while the media painted it as a wholesome, unifying moment, not everyone accepted the image at face value. Some saw authenticity, a young boy honoring sacrifice. Others saw strategy, an orchestrated attempt by the monarchy to salvage goodwill, in an era increasingly skeptical of inherited power. Praise came quickly, but so did the questions. Was George truly ready for this kind of exposure? Was it fair to expect him to carry a national legacy before his teenage years? On Twitter, the moment went viral clips of him shaking hands, listening intently, asking thoughtful questions. Thousands called it heartwarming, dignified, and hopeful. But in the shadow of that praise, there were louder whispers of concern. Critics accused the palace of grooming George too early, using him to distract from deeper cracks in the royal foundation. And those cracks have grown harder to ignore. Between Harry and Meghan's departure, Charles's health concerns, and the relentless media circus around Catherine, the monarchy stands on shaky ground. In that context, George's poised demeanor was less about a boy's growth and more about the institution's survival. Social media has only amplified this divide. Gone are the days when the royal family controlled the narrative through staged photographs and tightly scripted interviews. Now, every angle is dissected, every blink of the eye turned into a meme, a message, or a myth. The same moment that brought tears to a grandmother's eyes became fodder for cynics who see the monarchy as outdated theater. Platforms like TikTok and Instagram, dominated by Gen Z, often frame royal appearances as performative questioning. Whether the crown still holds relevance in a society that demands transparency and progress. And yet, ironically, George's presence might be the bridge between those two worlds. Not because he represents monarchy, but because he represents change. Quiet, deliberate change. A new generation of royalty learning not just how to wave, but how to listen. Still, the palace walks a razor-thin line. Cling too tightly to tradition, and the monarchy risks fading into irrelevance. Modernize too quickly, and it alienates the very institution it was built to protect. George's appearance on VE Day was the palace's answer to that paradox, a calculated risk meant to assure the public that the monarchy can still evolve without unraveling. But one event doesn't erase decades of criticism. One boy cannot restore a 1,000-year institution overnight. He can only begin the work of reshaping how it's seen. And that work has already started. Beyond the headlines, the essence of the monarchy's role in modern society comes into focus. As the sun sets on a day of remembrance, a new chapter in royal history begins to unfold. The faces of war heroes may fade from public memory. Their stories, tucked away in dusty archives or weathered scrapbooks. But on this VE Day, something rare happened. A child stood among them, not as a spectator, but as a symbol. Prince George's presence wasn't just endearing or ceremonial. It was a moment of historical gravity, one that drew a line between what the monarchy was and what it could become. Because in a world where institutions are questioned and legacies rewritten, the future of the royal family won't rest on titles or tradition alone. It will rest on relevance. And George, whether he realizes it yet or not, is already shaping that future with every handshake, every question, every quiet step beside his parents. That connection between generations, between the living past and the unfolding present, is what gives the monarchy its deepest meaning. Without it, it's just pageantry. But when a boy looks into the eyes of a man who once fought for his nation's freedom and listens not out of obligation, but with genuine interest, something powerful happens. History becomes human. The lessons of the past become anchors for the future. George's involvement in this day wasn't just respectful, it was strategic. It was the crown showing the world that remembrance isn't only about reflection. It's about passing the torch, not with fanfare, but with understanding, with intention. His upbringing will define the legacy he inherits. And unlike previous heirs, raised under rigid protocols and quiet emotional turbulence, George is growing up in a different palace, one shaped by empathy, transparency, and modern expectations. His mother, grounded in middle-class values, brings humanity to her royal role. His father, shaped by loss and scandal, brings caution. Together, they are sculpting a king who may one day be seen not as a distant ruler, but as a relatable leader. And if George continues to walk this path steeped in humility, guided by history, and supported by a family learning from its own past mistakes, he won't just represent the monarchy. He'll redefine it. Still, the world he will inherit is not the same world his grandmother ruled. Britain is shifting. The Commonwealth is restless. The idea of royalty itself is debated in dinner tables and online forums from Canada to the Caribbean. But this evolution doesn't mean extinction. It means adaptation. It means finding new ways to serve, new ways to lead. And George's generation has the rare chance to reimagine what that looks like, how ceremony can coexist with substance, how symbolism can still hold power in a skeptical age. The VE Day Tea Party may fade into the long list of royal engagements, but its meaning won't. For Prince George, it was more than a history lesson. It was a beginning. A quiet initiation into a world that will one day rest in his hands. And while no one can predict what kind of king he will become, one thing is certain: he is already listening, already learning, already stepping into the echoes of a past that will one day shape his rule. With the echoes of the past guiding his steps, Prince George embarks on a path toward a future intertwined with history. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.